In Chapter 16, we will begin discussing the Federal Reserve and monetary policy. How effective is monetary policy as a tool? So we're first off going to discuss what the Federal Reserve System is, how it's structured, and who the members are. Monetary policy is the actions taken by the Federal Reserve to try to influence the economy to have economic growth and also to avoid inflation. So if the economy is growing too quickly, monetary policy is used to slow down the economy. If the economy is growing too slowly, then we have the Federal Reserve will do things to try to increase it quickly. So the Federal Reserve System, we also known as the Central Bank of the United States. And the monetary policy, the Federal Reserve, is guided by a chair who is this individual here, which is Jerome Powell, and he leads the Federal Reserve at this time of the video. The Federal Reserve history, very briefly. We've talked about the banking history. Now we're going to briefly look at the Federal Reserve. The whole idea was at the beginning, remember we had Federalists, which is Alexander Hamilton, who was for the central bank, and then we had Thomas Jefferson, who was anti-Fed, who was more for giving power to the state banks instead of the federal government. We also have the introduction of reserves, the amount of money that banks need to have on hold to be available to lend money out to those who are saving their money in the banking system. And then they have reserve requirements, the amount of reserves that banks are required to keep on hand. And so for the longest time, when this is being implemented by the different charters, this was a requirement to make sure that the banking industry would stay strong by first having reserves ready available to lend out, but then also have enough always on task. So if you wanted to go to your bank today, and let's say that by a miracle you have $150,000 in there, you could not just withdraw that money. They might have all that money on hand depending on which bank branch you go to, but more than likely it's not available for cash wise because they have lent it out. They don't have all that money sitting in the bank, not at that bank at least. And so this was always the policy. Reserve requirements. And then the panic of 1907 changed all that. And some of the panic that happened in 1907 was from 1906 to 1907, there was a 50% drop at the peak of the stock market. And as a result of that, things began to crash. Banks began to foreclose, which is never a good sign. Businesses began to foreclose, people losing their houses. And if it wasn't for J.P. Morgan stepping in and stating that he will lend money to basically the American economy, to the government, he stopped that panic all at the same time. So being a titan of industry during his time, having the power to walk into the federal government or the Federal Reserve and basically say, I am going to lend you money, pretty powerful, pretty rich individual. And this is why for the longest time these titans of industry during this time could not be regulated because they were so powerful. They had more money than the federal government. 1913 comes around and the Federal Reserve is finally established on here permanently. We have the introduction of 12 independent regional banks, giving them power to really rule their region of the United States. And then 1935, we have the Federal Reserve restructured. And this was a result of, after the Roaring '20s, the Great Depression, Federal Reserve now was given more power, and then also the executive branch was given more power in 1935. So things were going pretty smoothly. 12 banks were doing their regions, and it wasn't until the Great Depression where things began to fall apart. Now, the structure of the Federal Reserve, and this is the same as it is today, what you find is you have a board of governors. These are not actually governors of states, so don't get that confused, but that's just a title they're given. We have 7 governors on the board. They can serve 14-year term. Board of governors can only serve one term. 14 years. And the way the 14 years is structured is so that one president can't have complete control over retiring or board of governors who have been on it for more than 14 years. Meaning that when a person comes in their 14 years, The president's job is to appoint a new member or a new chair, and then the Senate confirms. So if a president can be on for 8 years, 14 years means that it's long enough that the president will not have the ability to greatly influence the Board of Governors. When rightly so, a balance of power. We also find that the Federal Reserve is divided into 12 districts. And as you can see here in this image of the districts, you would find that we actually have one in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So if you go down to downtown Minneapolis, and I believe it's off of Hennepin and the river, you will actually be able to see the Federal Reserve Bank. I've actually had the opportunity to go and visit and go inside the bank itself, and it has the reserve crest on the outside of it, and it's quite the complex, quite secure bank that is down there. So complete security, and rightly so. This is where they're taking in money. Then each bank is made out of 9 directors. There is 3 from commercial banks, 3 from interest groups, and then 3 that are appointed by the Board of Governors. And again, directors are approved by the Board of Governors. So, Board of Governors, they get to appoint 3 of these for the 9 director banks. And whenever there is someone who is at the end of their term and they need to elect a new director, it has to be approved by the Board of Governors. Now, the structure below that, now we begin to see member banks. And this, I would probably say this is the 90 plus, if not 99% of banks are members of the FDIC, which is a Federal Reserve. So if you go into your bank and you see this sticker, this FDIC, what it means is that this banking branch or this banking company is backed by the FDIC. Meaning, if this bank collapses and you have $250,000 or less, the FDIC will refund you everything that you have in there. Now, if you have $300,000, they'll only go up to $250,000. So member banks get the seal approval, which is going to put confidence in the economy that people trust the banking industry. And remember, we talked about the banking industry, the wildcat era, where no one trusted banks anymore. The FDIC was designed to combat that. And then member banks have the opportunity to invest into the Federal Reserve and are given stock options. And there are investment fees to join, obviously, to be a part of the FDIC. Now, the last structure that we see here is structure of the FOMC. This is the Federal Open Market Committee. So you have the Board of Governors, then you have all of the directors of the banks, and now we have something called the FOMC. They meet 8 times a year. There's 12 members. You have your Board of Governors, which is the 7, which is kind of like the hierarchy of the entire thing. And then you have 5 district bank members, presidents. And it's on a rotation for the presidents, and they serve a 1-year term. So as a 1-year term, they'll do it, and then it rotates to the next 5 district banks. The only one that's a permanent member is New York, and there's reason behind that, which we'll get to at another time, but New York is the only permanent member on there. So again, Board of Governors, district presidents, and then we have the FOMC. That is the end of Chapter 16, Section 1.